Tell this room your eyes beat my algorithm.
You hang pictures in a shop window for a living. Let's see you hang your reputation on this one. You brought your own light. I brought the only light that matters here. Seriously? A lamp? Ridiculous. My software cost $40,000. Then it should not be afraid of a light bulb. It already gave its verdict. 94% probability of generative origin. Machines don't lie. Neither do brushes. Give me a minute with it. Take your time. I have all afternoon. You won't need it.
I angled the lamp low across the canvas. The light caught every ridge where a hand had changed its mind halfway through. 11 seconds passed before anyone in that hall said a word. "The paint is real," I said. "It was always going to be real. Your machine never doubted the paint. It was hired to doubt the man." "Then we're finished here." "Not yet. Paint remembers the hand that laid it down. Your algorithm has never held a brush in its life." That's a nice sentence. It's a true one, and you know it, or you wouldn't need a machine to say otherwise for you. He didn't answer that. He looked instead toward the widow standing near the door. "Ask her," he said. "Ask her whose word she trusts more tonight." "I already did," I said. "That's why I'm standing here." Somebody in that room, the one man Adelaide Kessler had trusted with every decision about her husband's legacy for almost 20 years, had spent 2 years teaching her to doubt her own husband's hand, just enough to make her sign his paintings away before she looked too closely, enough that nobody would ask questions when they quietly changed hands. I did not go looking for any of this. A frame that needed rehanging before a memorial exhibit put me in that hall. What kept me in it afterward was watching a 72-year-old widow realize in real time, in front of everyone she knew, that the man managing her husband's legacy might have been lying to her the entire time. I became the only person standing between Adelaide Kessler and losing the last honest proof of who her husband really was. And once I started asking the wrong questions out loud, that man made sure I understood exactly how much he was willing to risk to make me stop. He would eventually get close enough to my own son to say his name in front of me, just to prove that he could. To understand why that mattered so much, you have to understand what happened in my workshop 3 weeks earlier with a frame that was never supposed to matter this much. My name is Callum Doyle. I am 39 years old, and I fix corners for a living. That is the honest version of what a picture framer does. People bring me the things they love, usually a little damaged, sometimes a lot, and I build a box around them that keeps the world from touching them again. I learned the trade at 17, sweeping floors in the same shop I own now, on Miller Street in Brindle Falls, in a building that still smells like the cedar shavings from whatever the last owner cut 50 years before I arrived. The front window still says Ainsley Frame and Gallery in gold leaf lettering I have never had the heart to change, even though it has been my name on the business license for 5 years now. Regulars still call it Walter's shop out of habit, and I have never once corrected them. The man who taught me was named Walter Ainsley. He had spent 30 years before that as a portrait conservator, the kind of quiet expert nobody outside the art world ever hears of, and he took the framing shop over as a slower way to spend his last working years surrounded by paint without the pressure of restoring anything irreplaceable. What he actually gave me, without ever calling it a lesson, was a second education. He taught me to read a canvas the way some men read a room. Which layer went down first? How a brush loaded with too much paint drags differently than one loaded with too little. How a genuine crack pattern in old oil paint follows the pull of the canvas underneath it, while a printed reproduction with a texture coating sprayed over the top just sits there, dead and even, no matter how convincing it looks from 3 feet away. I remember one lesson in particular from my second year in the shop. I had brought him a landscape I was certain was a forgery, some estate sale find a customer wanted authenticated for insurance. I pointed at a tree line I thought looked too clean, too uniform, machine printed to my untrained eye. Walter set the canvas under his brass lamp, angled the light low, and told me to look again, closer this time, not at the tree line but at the grass just beneath it. "You're looking for what's wrong," he said. "Look for what's true instead. A real hand never paints anything twice the same way, even when it's trying to. Find me 2 identical brushstrokes in this whole canvas, and I'll believe your forgery theory." I never found them. Every stroke carried some small variation, a slightly heavier load of paint here, a slightly faster wrist there, proof of a living hand making 1,000 tiny decisions. No machine or careless copyist would bother making. Remember that, he said, closing the lamp's neck down for the night. A real hand never repeats itself exactly. Long after everything else about the moment is gone, that stays true. I did not know, at 22, how many times I would end up repeating that sentence to myself over the years that followed. I only knew it was the first time framing had felt like more than a trade to me. He died 5 years ago, on a Tuesday in March, and left me the shop and one other thing. A slim leather portfolio, cracked soft at the spine, that had belonged to a friend of his named Everett Kessler. Everett had been a landscape painter, well regarded around 3 counties but never famous beyond them, the kind of artist whose work hung in banks and libraries and the good parlors of people who had grown up with him. He and Walter had met when Walter restored a water-damaged canvas of Everett's back in the late 90s, and the two of them had stayed close until Everett's death in 2006. As a thank you for that restoration, Everett had given Walter a gift most collectors never see. Not a finished painting, a stack of his preparatory sketches, the loose charcoal studies he made on paper before he ever touched a brush to canvas, working out where a fence line should sit or how a barn roof should catch the evening light. Walter kept them in that leather portfolio for the rest of his life, and told me once, almost as an aside while we ate lunch in the back room, that paper like that was the truest thing an artist ever left behind, because nobody fakes their own homework. I did not think about that portfolio much in the years after Walter died. It sat on the top shelf of my workshop closet, next to a box of his old tools, and I mostly forgot it was there. My son Tobin is 7, and he has a habit that used to embarrass me a little before I let it go. Every time he walks into a building he has not been in before, he counts the steps out loud, whether there are 3 of them or 30, whether anyone is listening or not. His mother, Naomi, used to say it was his way of making a new place feel like his own before he trusted it. She died 3 years ago, on a Sunday 2 towns over, on a drive I was supposed to make with her before a cold kept me home. I have come to think Tobin counts louder now than he used to, like he is claiming a little more ground each time, for both of us. Some nights, counting the stairs up to a bedroom he has slept in his whole life. He seems to be making sure of something that has nothing to do with the stairs at all. Most afternoons after school, Tobin does his homework at the counter while I work. Math problems on one side of the glass, cut mat board on the other. He likes to guess what's inside a bundle before I unwrap it, based only on the weight of it in his own small arms when a customer hands it to him to carry in. He is usually right. He has grown up around enough frames and enough paintings that some of what Walter gave me seems to be finding its way into him too, whether I ever meant to teach it or not. Adelaide Kessler walked into my shop on a Thursday afternoon in early September, carrying a canvas wrapped in an old quilted moving blanket, and Tobin, who had come straight from school and was doing his homework at the counter, counted 11 steps from the door to where she stood before he even looked up. "I need this one done properly," Adelaide said, setting the bundle down with the careful weight of someone handling something more fragile than its size suggested. "It's the last one I still have full say over. There's a memorial exhibit at the Historical Hall next month, the town's way of remembering Everett properly, and I want this piece to be the centerpiece." I unwrapped it on my work table. It was a river scene, evening light, the kind of quiet late work an aging painter makes when he has stopped trying to impress anyone and started painting only what moves him. The frame around it had cracked along one corner, old and honest damage, nothing more. "He painted this from our back porch," Adelaide said, watching my hands rather than the canvas. "Every evening that whole last autumn, he'd carry his easel out there after supper and paint until the light gave out, sometimes only managing a few strokes before it was too dark to see the palette. I used to tease him that a river doesn't change enough between one evening and the next to be worth painting 50 separate times. He told me the river never changed. He did. Every evening he sat down a slightly different man than the one who had sat down the night before, and the painting was the only proof of that anybody would ever have." She touched the edge of the cracked frame. "He painted this the year before he died. I have 22 of his paintings left. I used to have 25. What happened to the other 3? She was quiet long enough that I set down the tool in my hand, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost the composure it carried a moment before. "Julian Thorne happened to them," she said, and pressed her fingers briefly against her mouth before she went on. "The way people do when they are deciding whether to let themselves cry in front of a near stranger. I keep thinking about the morning I signed those papers. He sat across from me at his own desk, so gentle, so sorry about the whole situation, and I remember thinking how lucky I was to have someone that careful looking after Everett's legacy for me." I drove home that afternoon and cried in my own driveway before I even went inside, and I told myself it was grief. It wasn't grief. Some part of me already knew something was wrong, and I signed anyway, because trusting him had become easier than doubting him. She took a breath and steadied herself. He has managed everything for Everett's estate since the year after his death. Insurance, appraisals, loan agreements, when a museum wants to borrow a piece. I trusted him with all of it because Everett trusted him first. And he sold 3 of your paintings? He told me they had to go. Said the insurers had changed their rules 2 years back, after that whole wave of news stories about generated art flooding the market. Said every high-value piece now needed what he called a generative origin risk report before any policy would renew, standard practice across the industry. Nothing he had any control over. His firm's report on those 3 came back with what he called an unacceptable AI probability score. He said, no honest insurer would touch them after that, and no honest buyer either, not once the report existed on paper. He said the kindest thing I could do was sell quickly, quietly, before the number got attached to Everett's name in some registry somewhere. She looked at the river painting on my table. I sold them for almost nothing, to a broker Julian recommended. I signed the papers in his office, and he was so gentle about it, like a doctor delivering bad news he wished he didn't have to give. Something about the phrase generative origin, risk report, sat wrong in my chest, the way a poorly cut mat board sits wrong under glass, invisible until you know exactly where to look. Did anyone else ever look at those 3 paintings before Thorne's report? Why would they? He's the expert. That's what we pay him for. I did not say anything else about it that day. I framed her river painting properly, matched the corner joint so it would hold for another 60 years, and told her it would be ready well before the exhibit. But that night, after Tobin was asleep, I went up to the workshop closet and took down Walter's leather portfolio for the first time in 5 years. Inside were 11 charcoal studies, each one a working sketch for a finished Everett Kessler painting. I recognized 3 of them immediately, because I had grown up seeing the finished versions hanging in the county library, walked past them 1,000 times as a kid without once thinking about who had made them or how. I drove to the library the next morning before it opened and waited in the parking lot with my coffee going cold, then walked straight to the reading room where 2 of Everett's paintings had hung for as long as I could remember. Both matched sketches in the portfolio exactly, right down to a small compositional change in one. A fence post moved a few feet to the right sometime between the drawing and the final canvas, the kind of decision only a living hand revises partway through. And in the portfolio's last few pages I recognized a 4th sketch, one I had not placed the night before, because Adelaide had just described the finished version to me only an hour earlier. A barn at dusk, the exact composition of one of the 3 paintings Thorne had convinced her to sell for almost nothing. If that finished painting had actually been created by a machine 2 years ago, the way Thorne's report claimed, there was no explaining why a paper sketch for it, in Everett Kessler's own handwriting in the margin, had been sitting in my closet since 2006. I made a mistake that week that I would spend the next month trying to fix. I called Julian Thorne directly at his office, introduced myself as the framer working on Adelaide's collection, and told him I had questions about the report on the barn painting. I asked, as plainly as I could manage, to see his methodology. "That's proprietary," he said, his voice unhurried, almost kind. "I understand a layman's curiosity, Mr. Doyle, but a framer questioning a certified authentication process is a bit like a picture hanger questioning a structural engineer. I'd be happy to explain the basics over the phone, if it would put your mind at ease. I'd rather see the report itself, the full version, not the summary Adelaide was given." There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to hear him decide something. "I'll have my assistant pull it," he said. "These things take a few days to compile properly." I thought, hanging up the phone, that I had asked a careful question and given nothing away. I understood only later that a man who has spent 20 years managing what other people are allowed to see does not need much to know exactly what a threat sounds like, even dressed up as a polite request. Instead, it told him exactly what I knew and exactly how much time he had left before I proved it. 3 days later, Adelaide called, and I could hear in the first 2 words that something had already gone wrong. "I sold the meadow painting," she said, "the one with the split-rail fence. I know I told you I wasn't ready to let that one go." Julian came by yesterday evening, said a competing appraiser had raised urgent questions about the piece's authenticity, and that moving quickly, quietly, before any public controversy attached itself to Everett's name, was the only responsible choice left. He made it sound like he was protecting me from something worse, Adelaide, there is no competing appraiser. There's only him. I know that now, she said, and the silence after that was worse than anything she could have said next. She had signed again. I had given him a reason to move faster instead of a reason to stop, and I understood too late that asking a careful question out loud to the person doing the damage is sometimes the same as handing him a countdown clock. I decided not to make that mistake twice. If I was going to stop him, I needed the second and third pieces of proof before I said another word to him directly. The second piece came from Harriet Colby, a former gallery assistant who had worked for Thorne's firm for 4 years before she quit, 6 months before Adelaide ever brought me that river painting. I found her through Ruth Calder, the historical hall coordinator organizing the memorial exhibit, a brisk woman in her 60s who had spent 30 years running the town's small museum and knew everyone connected to Everett Kessler's world, living or dead. When I asked her, carefully, whether she knew anyone who used to work for Julian Thorne, she studied me for a long moment before answering. Harriet Colby, she finally said. Left about 6 months back, angrier than she'd ever admit to my face. I always wondered why a woman who loved that job as much as she did would walk away from it without another position lined up. Why do you ask? I told her only that I had questions about an authentication report, nothing more. Ruth did not push, but she found Harriet's number in the exhibit's loan paperwork without a second thought, the kind of small trust a town like Brindle Falls still runs on. Harriet agreed to meet me at a diner outside town, a place with cracked vinyl booths and a coffee pot that never seemed to sit empty for more than a minute. And she arrived early, already nervous, checking the parking lot through the window twice before she sat down across from me. She had signed a non-disparagement agreement on her way out of Thorne's office. Standard paperwork in a gallery world small enough that one bad word from a man like him could follow a person for the rest of her career. And she seemed to know, sitting down across from me, that she was about to violate it in spirit, if not in letter. She did not need much convincing once I showed her Walter's sketch of the barn. I quit that job for a reason I never said out loud to anyone, she told me, turning the sketch over carefully in her hands like it might bruise. I told people it was the hours. It wasn't the hours. What was it? The way he talked about Adelaide Kessler when she wasn't in the room. Never unkind, exactly. Just patient, like a man managing a resource instead of a client. He'd say things like, she'll come around, or she trusts the process more than she trusts her own eyes now. I told myself for 2 years that was just how estate management sounded from the inside. Then I stopped being able to tell myself that. He never let anyone else near the insurance files, she said. Not even me, and I did every other piece of paperwork in that office. Every generative origin report he ever issued on a Kessler piece, he wrote alone, printed alone, and mailed alone. I always thought that was strange for a man who delegated literally everything else. Did you ever see who actually bought the pieces after they sold? Not directly, but I remember a name that came up on a wire transfer confirmation once, sitting on his desk when I brought in his coffee. A company called Fenridge Fine Art Partners. I only remember it because it sounded made up, like a name you'd invent if you needed one fast. She paused. About 4 months after I saw that, I noticed a painting for sale at a gallery 2 towns over, a piece I recognized from Adelaide's collection, listed for full market value, with paperwork describing a fresh authentication using what the listing called traditional connoisseurship methods, superseding an earlier flawed algorithmic screening. Like the machine had been wrong the whole time, and some other expert had generously come along to correct it. Who signed that second authentication? I don't know, but I know the gallery it sold through, and I know Julian owns a piece of it, quietly, through a holding company. It's not his name on anything. It never is. That was the third link, sitting right there in front of me if I could just find the paper to prove it. I ran the search that night at my kitchen table. After Tobin went to bed, the house quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the small blue light of the laptop screen. The state's business registry search took only a few seconds to return a result, and I sat looking at it for much longer than that, checking the same 3 lines over and over as if they might change. Fenridge Fine Art Partners, registered as a limited liability company 4 years earlier, listed with a registered agent named T. Wren, at an address that turned out, when I searched it separately, to be a mailbox rental 2 blocks from Thorne's office, the kind of place that rents out a numbered box and calls it a suite. The same registered agent, T. Wren, also appeared on the paperwork for the gallery 2 towns over, the one now quietly reselling Everett Kessler's undervalued paintings at full price under a story about a corrected authentication. He had never planned to reverse his own report. That would have raised questions about his firm's competence. Instead, He let a different company, wearing a different name, discover the truth on his behalf and profit twice from the same lie. Once by buying low through fabricated doubt, and once by selling high through a manufactured correction that never once mentioned his original verdict. I had the first link, Walter's sketch, sitting safe in a portfolio Thorne did not know existed. I had the second link, Harriet's memory of the wire transfer and the resale listing. I needed the third link tied directly to money, something that would hold up outside of a conversation at a diner. I thought, more than once that week, about something else Walter used to say, back when I was young enough to complain that nobody ever noticed how much care went into a good frame. Paint remembers the hand that laid it down, he told me once, setting down his brush and looking at me the way he did when a lesson mattered more than he wanted to let on. And so does everyone a hand has ever shaped, whether that hand held a brush or held a child steady while he learned to cross a street. I had never heard it as a rule about people before. That week, watching Adelaide sign away more of her trust to the very man taking it from her, it started sounding like exactly that. That was when Thorne found Tobin. Brindle Falls Community Center runs an after-school art class on Tuesdays, the kind of thing where a dozen 7- and 8-year-olds sit at long tables with paper and cheap paint while a volunteer walks around offering encouragement. Tobin had been going for 6 weeks. I picked him up every Tuesday at 5 and never once thought to ask who ran the volunteer sign-in sheet. The picture man said my barn was good, Tobin told me in the truck that Tuesday, proud of himself, holding up a construction paper drawing of a red barn with a lopsided roof. He said he knew a real barn painting once that looked just like mine. He said his name was Mr. Thorne. He knew my name too. He said it before I told him. I do not remember driving home. I remember sitting in the truck outside our house for a long while afterward, Tobin already inside eating a snack at the kitchen table, my hand still on the wheel, though the engine had been off for minutes. I ran through every version of what I should do next, calling the police that night, calling Adelaide, driving straight to Thorne's office and saying something I would regret, and none of them felt like they would actually keep my son safer in the morning. What I settled on, sitting there in the dark, was the only thing that felt like it might. Find out exactly how he had gotten that close, and close the door behind him before he could walk through it again. I remember standing in the community center parking lot the following morning before the doors even opened, watching the director, a tired-looking man named Preston Boyle, fumble with his keys while I explained why I needed to see the volunteer roster right away. Mr. Thorne? Sure, he's been terrific, Preston said, pulling up the sign-in sheet on a clipboard behind the front desk. Donated art supplies for the whole class back in August. Passed his background check same as everybody. Why, is there a problem? How did he end up volunteering for this specific class? He called us, actually, said he wanted to give back to the community, mentioned he'd read about the class in the town newsletter. Preston flipped a page. Signed up the Tuesday after that. Been here every week since. I did the math standing right there in the lobby. The town newsletter had run its piece on the art class in early August. Adelaide had brought me the river painting in early September. Thorne had been sitting in that classroom, 3 tables away from my son, before I had ever asked him a single question about the barn sketch, before he had any reason yet to know I suspected anything at all. He had not followed Tobin into that room because of what I knew. He had put himself there months earlier, patiently, the way a man plants something he may or may not ever need to use. Learning my son's name and complimenting his drawing of a barn had simply been the moment he chose to let me see the seed he had already planted. He had never been watching my son. He had been watching Walter's shop, the way I would later come to understand he had been watching it for years, and my boy was simply the newest thing that had walked out of it. I learned, later, that Julian Thorne had signed up as a volunteer judge for the Children's Art Showcase 5 weeks before Adelaide ever walked into my shop, using his real name, passing a basic background check that had no reason to flag a respected local business owner. He had not touched my son. He had not threatened him with a single word a 7-year-old could understand as a threat. He had simply spent 5 Tuesdays proving, patiently, that he could get close enough to know my son's name before I ever gave it to him, and close enough to compliment a child's drawing of the exact subject at the center of the fraud he was running. It was a message built entirely out of things that would sound, to anyone else, like kindness. I withdrew Tobin from the class that afternoon. I did not call the police because Tobin could not describe a single thing that had actually happened to him that a court would recognize as a crime. What I called instead was the community center director, then Ruth Calder, then, finally, a state consumer protection investigator whose name I found on the insurance commissioner's website, a woman who worked specifically on financial fraud involving elderly residents. The investigator's name was Denise Farr, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, which somehow made the news that followed harder to hear. "I believe you," she said when I finished. "For what that's worth. I've seen this exact shape of scheme twice before, just with different dressing. Old fraud, new vocabulary. A generative origin report is just a coat of paint on the same con people have been running on elderly collectors for decades." She tapped her pen against a legal pad. "But belief doesn't open a case. Here's what I have to work with. A sketch that predates the report, which proves the report was wrong, not that it was fraudulent. A second-hand recollection from a former employee about a wire transfer she glimpsed once, which is compelling but not evidence. And a business registry showing a shell company with a suspicious name, which proves nothing about Thorne personally unless his name is actually on it somewhere. So none of it matters. It matters plenty. It's just not enough yet on its own to force a licensing board to act against a man with 20 years of clean reputation behind him. I need something that ties his own name, not a shell company's name, directly to the money on both ends of this. The buying and the selling both. Find me that, and I can move fast." That call was its own kind of setback. Thorne, for his part, seemed to sense exactly how close I had gotten and exactly how far short I still was. 2 days after I withdrew Tobin from the art class, Adelaide called again, her voice smaller than I had heard it. "I signed something today," she said. "Julian came by the house himself, said an unlicensed framer with what he called a personal grudge had been making unfounded accusations, and that the collection needed one clear authority making decisions going forward, not competing opinions confusing everything. It seemed reasonable the way he explained it. I signed before I thought to call you first. I asked her to read me exactly what she had signed, and understood, listening to her go through it line by line, that she had granted his firm exclusive authority over every remaining authentication decision for the collection. With that signature, I lost whatever standing I had to request records directly. And Adelaide, gently and without meaning to, had just made it a formal breach of her own agreement for her to keep talking to me about any of it. He had turned my own investigation into the reason she trusted him more, not less. I sat with that for 2 days before I understood what I had been missing. It was not hidden in some bank file I would never be allowed to see. It was sitting in the same registry I had already searched once, one tab over from where I had stopped looking. Fenridge Fine Art Partners had taken out a working capital loan 2 years earlier, and the UCC financing statement filed with the Secretary of State to secure that loan listed, beneath the description of collateral, the name of the person who had personally guaranteed the debt, Julian Thorne. Public record, free to search, filed the same month the company was formed. Nobody hides from a loan they personally guaranteed. Adelaide's lawyer voided the exclusive authority agreement the same afternoon the filing surfaced. A contract signed on a lie, he told her, was not a contract. It was Exhibit C. I called Denise Farr the same afternoon, and this time her voice on the phone had a different energy to it, quicker, more awake. "Read that back to me exactly," she said, and I did. UCC filing, lender name, collateral description, personal guarantor Julian Thorne, filed the same month Fenridge was formed. I heard her writing as she spoke. That's it. That's the piece connecting him personally to both sides of this, the buying company and, through the gallery ownership records Harriet already pointed us toward, the selling side too. I can request the full loan file with that. I can open the case today. That was the third link. Not a hidden confession. A public filing, sitting in plain sight the entire time, that nobody had thought to search a second time. Tobin stayed with a neighbor that Saturday, and before I left he asked me, counting the steps down our own porch the way he counted every set of stairs now, whether I was scared. I told him a little. He told me Walter's lamp would know what to do, which was as close to right as anything I could have said myself. The memorial exhibit opened that afternoon in the main hall of the Brindle Falls Historical Society. 22 of Everett Kessler's paintings arranged around the room in the order Adelaide had chosen, folding chairs filling in fast, the river scene from my shop, given the place of honor at the far end precisely because it was the one painting in the whole collection Thorne had never managed to touch. Adelaide caught my eye across the room once, briefly, and I understood without either of us saying anything that we both knew exactly why he would come for that piece specifically, in front of everyone, before the afternoon was through. Thorne arrived early, as the estate's official advisor, and made a show of inspecting the centerpiece in front of the gathering crowd, his laptop open on a side table, his generative origin report already printed and ready to hand to anyone who asked. It was the last piece in the entire collection Adelaide still had full say over, the one no manufactured doubt had touched yet, and I understood, watching him set up beside it, that he needed this room to doubt it publicly before she ever had the chance to decide its fate herself. He had checked, of course, before he ever chose me for it. A framer with no credentials, no standing, and as of 2 days earlier, a signed agreement that cut him off from every record in the collection. Crushing the one doubter this town had produced, in public, in front of the woman who had just signed away my access to stop him, was not a risk to a man like Thorne. It was the last item on his cleanup list. He gave the room the challenge you have already heard me answer, setting the canvas down hard enough to rock the easel. What the room had not heard yet was everything I had spent 3 weeks carrying toward that easel. I already knew, by then, exactly what I was going to say back to him. After the raking light, after the 11 seconds of silence, after I gave that room the answer I had been carrying for 3 weeks, I did not stop there. I opened Walter's leather portfolio on the table beside his laptop and laid the barn sketch flat next to its finished painting, the one hanging 4 feet away that Thorne had once declared 94% likely to be generative. Paper against canvas, the same fence line, the same roof line, the same small correction where Everett had moved a tree 6 inches to the left and never bothered to erase the first version underneath. A machine generating an image from a prompt doesn't leave behind its own rough draft, I said. It doesn't sit up late deciding where a tree should go and then change its mind. Only a hand does that. And this hand belonged to a man half the people in this room grew up watching paint. Adelaide stepped forward before Thorne could answer. She had, it turned out, spent the last 2 days on the phone with the state investigator herself, once I finally had the loan filing to hand over. Julian sold 3 of my husband's paintings for almost nothing, telling me a machine had judged them worthless, she said, her voice steady in a way I had not heard from her before. The same 3 paintings sold again 8 months later, for full price, through a gallery he quietly owns, with new paperwork claiming a better expert had corrected the machine's mistake. And a public loan filing confirms his name has been tied to that gallery's shell company since the day it opened. She looked at the room, not at him. Nobody at this exhibit needs to take my word for any of that, or Callum's. There is a sketch that predates his report by nearly 20 years. There is a former employee who watched him write every one of these reports alone. And there is his own signature, on a public record anyone in this room could have searched, connecting the buyer to the seller, both of them him, the whole time. For a moment, Thorne said nothing at all. I watched him do the same thing I had seen him do once before on the phone, deciding something behind his eyes before he let his face catch up to it. "This is a misunderstanding," he said finally, to the room more than to us. "Business partnerships are not crimes. My firm's original assessment was made in good faith, using the best available technology at the time. If a later, more thorough review corrected that assessment, that is simply how expertise is supposed to work." "Then why hide your name from both reviews?" Adelaide asked. "Why write the first one alone and let a company nobody could trace to you sign the second?" He did not answer that. Ruth Calder, standing near the door with her arms crossed, quietly took out her phone. Somewhere behind me I heard someone say Denise Farr's name into another phone, low, already making the call. Thorne did not run. Men like him rarely do, not in front of a room full of witnesses who could later describe exactly how he looked when it happened. He closed his laptop, said something about consulting his attorney, and walked out through the front doors of the historical hall into an afternoon that had, without his noticing, already turned against him. The soft version of justice arrived over the following weeks, the way it usually does in a town too small for anything louder. The State Consumer Protection Division opened a formal fraud investigation into Thorne's generative origin reports and his quiet ownership of Fen Ridge Fine Art Partners. His appraiser's license was suspended pending the outcome, and the state licensing board began its own separate review of every report he had filed for the past 6 years, not just the ones touching Everett Kessler's paintings. The 3 paintings from that first report were returned to Adelaide under a negotiated settlement, along with the difference between what she was paid and what they had actually sold for. He did not go to prison that autumn. He lost the thing he had spent 20 years building instead, which was the trust of a town that talks to itself, at church and at the grocery store and across fences, faster than any headline ever could. The Meadow painting never came home. It sold once, legally, to a buyer overseas the settlement could not reach, on an afternoon I bought with one careless phone call. Adelaide has never once mentioned it to me since. That is its own kind of mercy, and its own kind of bill. Ruth Calder called me a month later to say the Historical Hall had asked 3 independent appraisers, none of them affiliated with Thorne's firm in any way, to review the rest of Adelaide's collection at no charge, as a gesture of goodwill after everything that had come out. Every remaining piece came back clean. Adelaide asked me to reframe all 3 returned paintings myself, using the same corner joints I had used on the river scene, and I spent 3 evenings in the workshop getting each one exactly right, the barn painting last of all. When I delivered them to her house, she set them side by side against the living room wall and stood looking at all 3 for a long while before she said anything. Everett once told me a stranger from out of town offered Walter real money for that portfolio, she said. Years before you were even his apprentice. Enough to matter, Everett said, enough that most men would have taken it without a second thought. Walter turned it down flat and never told Everett why. I always assumed it was sentiment. She touched the edge of the barn painting's new frame. I don't think it was sentiment anymore. I think he already understood exactly what that portfolio would be worth someday, and to whom, and he wasn't selling proof to a man who might someday need to buy his way out of a lie. Do you remember what the stranger looked like? Patient, Adelaide said after a moment. Well-dressed, the kind of man who never needs to raise his voice. Neither of us said the name. Neither of us needed to. I had never thought about it that way, but standing there, I understood she was probably right. He told her paper-like that was the truest thing an artist ever left behind, I said, because nobody fakes their own homework. I was right about more than the paintings, Adelaide said. What a hand shapes carries the mark of it forever. That's not just paint. That's raising a child too, isn't it? Every mark you leave on him, on purpose or not, is still there under whatever he grows into later. I thought about that for a long time after she said it. Tobin still counts steps out loud in every new building we walk into, and I have stopped wanting him to stop. He never went back to the community center art class, but I set up a corner of the workshop for him instead, with his own small table pushed up against the wall under Walter's old brass lamp. Last week I brought him in for the first real lesson, set a scrap of canvas and an old worn brush in front of him, and showed him how to load just enough paint and no more, the same way Walter once showed me. He pressed the bristles down too hard at first, the way every beginner does, and I let him find that out for himself before I said anything. Why does it matter? He asked, wiping a smear of blue off his knuckle. If anybody can tell the difference between my painting and just a copy of it? Because paint remembers the hand that laid it down, I told him, long after the hand is gone. That's the only kind of proof that never needs an algorithm to back it up. He nodded like that made perfect sense to a 7-year-old, picked up the brush, and got to work, counting his own strokes out loud the way he counts everything else, claiming this new ground the same careful way he claims all the others.